I was still wearing the black dress from my husband's funeral when my son told me to move into the garage. The scent of lilies hadn't even faded from the flower arrangements, and the photo of my husband, the one in the silver frame they placed near the casket, still sat in my lap. I was holding it like a child clutches a stuffed toy, not ready to let go. But my son was done grieving, or maybe he never started. He stood in the hallway, eyes dry, voice cold, and said, "You'll be more comfortable in the garage for now. We need the guest room." That was it. No apology, no explanation, just a tone that made it clear. My presence was no longer convenient. My knees buckled, but I stayed upright. I looked at him, this grown man I had carried inside me, protected from bullies, fed when there wasn't enough for myself, and I felt something collapse inside. Not rage, not even sadness, just something soft and final, like a door clicking shut forever. I didn't ask questions. I didn't cry. I nodded, stood, and walked down the hallway like a ghost. Past the kitchen I once stocked, past the playroom where I watched his children while he and his wife went to Cancun last spring, a trip I helped pay for, and finally into the cold, unfinished garage where I would sleep beside power tools and paint cans with a single hanging bulb as my nightlight. The cot they laid out was thin and creaked with every breath I took. No blanket, no pillow, just me and a box labeled Christmas stuff for company. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, which wasn't really a ceiling at all, just beams and wires and the groan of pipes above me. I could hear them moving upstairs, laughing, walking, the TV humming with whatever show made them forget there was a human being alone and grieving just a floor below. I felt like luggage left in the basement, like something they didn't want to throw away but couldn't make room for. I thought about my husband. I thought about the last thing he said to me. "He'll take care of you, you know. He's a good man." And I wanted to scream, not because it wasn't true then, but because it wasn't true now. Somewhere along the line, my son had changed. Or maybe I just stopped being useful. I had been the emergency contact, the babysitter, the holiday chef, the backup wallet when times got tight. I had poured myself into their lives like water into a vase that never overflowed. I didn't think of it as sacrifice. I thought it was love. That's what mothers do. We don't keep score. But maybe we should. Maybe then we'd know when the game has ended. Lying on that cot, I began to replay the years. The phone calls I answered at 2 a.m., the rent I paid when they missed a month, the groceries I stocked when their fridge ran low. I remembered cleaning the baby's bottles while his wife napped. I remembered the birthday cakes, the Christmas toys, the extra plane tickets. Every act of love now felt like a receipt I never asked them to repay. And now, suddenly, I was the debt they didn't want. That was the hardest part. Not the garage, not the silence, but the way they looked at me like I was a stain they couldn't scrub out. I had become inconvenient, uncomfortable, an echo from a chapter they were ready to close. But I wasn't just a chapter. I was the author of their beginning. And yet, here I was, in the garage like a forgotten epilogue nobody reads. I knew then that something had shifted, not just in the house, but in me. Something cold began to settle beneath my ribs. Not hate, not yet, but something close, a quiet turning, a slow realization that I was not loved, not in the way I thought, not in the way that mattered. I was tolerated, and tolerance is the cousin of contempt. I closed my eyes and wondered how long they had been waiting to put me here. Did they talk about it before the funeral? Was this the plan all along? Did they smile at me during the service while already deciding which corner of the garage I'd fit into? I don't know which thought was worse, that they decided in a moment of stress, or that they decided long ago and just waited for death to give them the excuse. Either way, the result was the same. I was alone, in a garage, wearing a black dress, holding a photo of the only man who ever loved me without conditions. And even he had left me. The cot creaked again beneath me, and somewhere upstairs, someone flushed a toilet. Life continued above me. For them, at least. For me, it paused, cracked, split open, and something old and buried inside me began to wake. Before the garage, before the funeral, before the silence that fell over my name like a thick blanket of dust, there were years, decades really, where I believed we were close. I wasn't the kind of mother who stood at a distance, offering advice like unwanted seasoning over their lives. I was present. I was involved. I showed up. When my son scraped his knee at 6, I stayed up late whispering comfort. When he failed his first college exam and called me sobbing, I listened without judgment. I helped him fill out job applications when he was too ashamed to ask his friends. I was the constant he never noticed because I was always there, the background warmth in every phase of his life. And when he met his wife, I opened my arms to her too, wide and without hesitation. I told her she was family. I offered her the heirloom earrings passed down by my grandmother, and I meant it when I said she was like a daughter to me. They moved into their new home on the outskirts of town, a home they could barely afford. And when the first mortgage bill arrived with numbers too big to manage, I quietly stepped in. I sold off my jewelry. I dipped into our retirement. I lied to my husband and said I needed a dental procedure because I didn't want him to worry. When they had their first child, they were overwhelmed, sleepless, clueless. And who came running with diapers, casseroles, and a rocking chair? Me. I remember sleeping on their couch for weeks, waking up every 2 hours to feed the baby while they slept through it, claiming exhaustion. I didn't complain. I smiled. I wanted to help. When the second baby came, I did it all over again. They thanked me less that time. The third child came a few years later, unexpected and unwanted, and they looked at me like a solution. They didn't ask me to move in. They assumed, and I agreed. Not because I was pressured, but because I loved them. That's what makes this story so heavy. I didn't see the chains because I put them on myself. Every ride to school, every grocery run, every time I handed over my debit card to cover this just once. I told myself I was investing in love, in security, in family. But looking back now, I wonder if I was just buying a seat at a table they always intended to pull away. It didn't happen all at once. That's the cruelty of it. You don't wake up one morning and realize you've been erased. It happens slowly, in subtle moments. The day he forgot my birthday but posted his wife's spa day on Instagram. The Christmas where my gifts were tossed aside while they cheered for a new flat screen. The whispered complaints when I started forgetting things. Maybe it's her age, I heard her say once in the kitchen, not knowing I was standing just beyond the hallway. I began to feel like furniture, useful, familiar, but unnoticed. They stopped asking how I was sleeping. They stopped offering me a seat at the table when friends came over. I was asked to watch the kids while they attended weddings and retreats, but never once was I invited to join. They started locking the pantry at night because their son claimed I snacked too much. I began eating in silence. Canned soup, toast, whatever didn't need permission. Still, I never confronted them. I kept telling myself it would pass, that they were just busy, stressed, young. But deep down, a part of me was shrinking. I started smiling less. I walked slower. I stayed in my room when company came. I became the ghost of their good times, the unpaid nanny who had nothing left to give. I kept count, not intentionally, but like bruises you try not to notice. The times they left without saying goodbye, the dinners they didn't invite me to, the whispered arguments where my name came up like a burden they couldn't shake. Once I overheard my son say, "She's just there all the time. I can't breathe." It stung, more than I expected, because I had built my life around making sure he could breathe freely. And now my very presence felt like suffocation. Still, I stayed. I thought maybe the grandchildren would pull them back to me. I hoped one day one of them would run into my arms and remind their parents that I mattered. But even they started mimicking what they saw. They rolled their eyes when I spoke. They snatched their tablets out of my hands when I asked what game they were playing. They began calling me by my first name instead of grandma, little things. But they piled high. And still, I stayed. I reminded myself that families go through seasons, that maybe this was just winter, cold, dark, and cruel. But spring would come. The house was full of my fingerprints, my money, my memories. It had to mean something. I convinced myself of that right up until the day I walked out of that funeral car and found my suitcases waiting by the garage door. No conversation, no questions, just a silent decree that the guest room was no longer mine. And just like that, I understood. This wasn't winter. It was foreclosure. On love, on loyalty, on everything I thought I had earned with years of sacrifice. And that's when something in me stopped hoping. Living in that garage changed something in me, not suddenly, but steadily, like water warping wood over time. The first few days, I tried to keep myself busy. I organized the tool shelves. I folded the towels they used for washing the car. I even swept the floor, hoping maybe they'd notice. Maybe they'd remember I was still trying. But no one noticed. No one came to check if I was warm at night or if the cold concrete made my joints ache. It was summer, but the garage held a kind of permanent chill, the kind that settles in your bones when the people you love have stopped seeing you. The nights were the worst. I could hear the hum of the dishwasher upstairs, the bursts of laughter from the living room, the sound of wine glasses clinking against marble counters, and me, beneath it all, lying stiff on a cot that groaned with every breath I took. There was no insulation, so I heard everything, even the silences. I began to measure time by footsteps overhead. I knew who was walking where and when. I began to count how many days passed without a single knock on the garage door. I left it unlocked, hoping one of the kids might come in, curious, maybe ask for a story or just a hug. But they never did. Once, I thought I heard the handle jiggle, and my heart leapt, but it was only the wind. I started eating alone, when no one could see me. Crackers, cold soup, the stale leftover pastries I had saved from the funeral. I didn't want to be seen scavenging from the pantry like a raccoon. They had started locking it again, after all, and even if they hadn't, I didn't want to give them one more reason to think of me as a burden. The humiliation wasn't loud. It was in the quiet decisions, the way things were arranged. The day I overheard them laughing about needing the garage space back because they wanted to convert it into a gym. The time my daughter-in-law asked, loudly and deliberately, whether maybe it would be better if she stayed at a senior center, just temporarily, just until we all feel less crowded. I wasn't meant to hear it, but I did. And I watched my son say nothing, not defend me, not shut it down, just sit there, nodding, sipping his coffee. That silence hurt more than anything, because it told me what he really felt, that I was a complication, that he didn't want me there. He just didn't want to be the one to say it. So instead, they made it uncomfortable enough for me to make the decision for them. It's a slow form of erasure. First, you're asked to stay out of the kitchen, then you're not invited to dinner. Then you stop appearing in family photos. I watched them upload pictures from outings I didn't even know happened. I scrolled through their social media from the garage and saw photos at restaurants, movie nights, beach trips. Always smiling, always captioned, family time. But I wasn't in any of them. It's a strange kind of grief, the kind that comes not from death, but from slow disappearance. I tried to keep my mind busy. I crocheted until my fingers cramped. I sorted through old letters. I wrote a few that I never sent. One to my late husband, one to myself, and one to the little boy my son used to be. I missed that boy more than I missed anyone. The one who used to press his cheek against my arm when he was scared. The one who would ask me to stay just 5 more minutes at bedtime. I don't know when he left. I don't know if he left or if he grew into someone else. But I knew that boy would have cried to see his mother sleeping on a cot beside car tires. Sometimes I caught a glimpse of myself in the reflection of the garage window. A thin, hunched woman in a black dress, her eyes darkened not by age but by disappointment. I looked like someone I would have pitied, someone I would have invited inside. And yet, the people upstairs, the ones I had bled for, couldn't spare me a pillow. I tried not to hate them. I reminded myself of their stress, their grief, their youth. I told myself forgiveness was the only thing keeping me sane. But there's a kind of sadness that forgiveness can't swallow, the kind that grows teeth, and mine were beginning to show. I began listening more closely. Eavesdropping, if I'm being honest. Not out of spite, but out of desperation. I needed to feel involved, even if it was only as an unseen observer. That's when I heard them arguing about money again. She should be contributing something, she said. She's just living here, taking up space. My son mumbled something I couldn't make out. Then she said it. She's not even your responsibility anymore. Your dad's gone. This shouldn't be on us. That was the moment I realized she saw me as a debt inherited through marriage. Not a mother-in-law, not a human being, just a leftover obligation now that the man who married her in was gone. My hands shook as I folded the same sweater for the 3rd time that morning. Not from rage, from recognition. They were preparing themselves to push me further out. The garage wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the end. I began to hear whispers of retirement homes, brochures left near the kitchen sink, hints dropped too loudly in conversations I was never meant to hear. But I heard them. I always heard them. I was just too polite to interrupt, too proud to beg, too broken to fight. And so I sat in the garage, quietly unraveling, wondering how many more nights it would take before they forgot I was still down there. Something in me shifted the morning I watched them walk past the garage window without glancing inside. They were headed to brunch, dressed well, the kids climbing into the car with laughter, and not one of them looked my way. I didn't expect them to wave. I didn't even expect them to smile. But the sheer indifference, the effortless bypassing of the person who had once given everything for them, pierced something that had been holding me together. I stood there with a spoonful of instant coffee hovering above a chipped mug, staring at the dust trails their tires left behind, and realized I wasn't just forgotten. I was erased. And once you recognize that, something important happens. You stop needing their validation. You stop shrinking to fit their comfort. I stopped trying to make the garage look like a room. I stopped folding their laundry out of habit. I stopped leaving the garage door slightly ajar just in case someone came to say goodnight. They didn't. And now, I didn't want them to. I began watching them not as family, but as figures in a play I was no longer cast in. I saw things more clearly now. How my daughter-in-law rolled her eyes when the youngest child asked about Grandma's birthday. How my son avoided conversations about finances as if he knew his guilt would bubble up through the cracks. How they started closing their bedroom door more often, as if privacy could protect them from the truth of what they were doing. I no longer tried to understand them. I observed them, cataloged them, not out of bitterness, not yet, but out of curiosity. What happens to people when they abandon the one who once carried them? Do they sleep better? Do they laugh louder? Or does something begin to rot in the corners of their joy? These were the questions I turned over in my head each night as I lay on that thin cot, wrapped in a coat I had found in a donation box by the door. They hadn't offered me a blanket, so I stopped pretending I needed one. That was the beginning of my detachment. Not from love. Love had long since been drained out, a slow leak I hadn't noticed until the tank was dry, but from hope. Detachment is quiet. It doesn't scream or slam doors. It just pulls the plug on whatever's left inside you and watches it drain without blinking. I no longer cried when I overheard them discussing me. I didn't flinch when the kids left food wrappers on the garage floor like I was the housemaid. I didn't react when I found my wedding portrait stuffed into a storage bin beneath old soccer gear. That one stung more than I'll admit. But I placed the frame back in the bin and closed it, sealing the memory away. I began spending my days doing less, moving slower, talking to myself in whispers. I wrote letters I never mailed. I made lists I never used. I imagined conversations that would never happen, where he apologized, where she cried, where they told me they finally understood. But even in those fantasies, their voices sounded hollow. I had detached even from the dream of being seen, and still, life carried on above me like I had never existed. They celebrated birthdays without me, went on outings I wasn't invited to, hosted friends who never asked where I was. I became something they edited out of the story they were telling about their lives, a character too complex, too inconvenient to include. But I was still watching, still noting everything. Like the locked drawer in the hallway desk that he never used before. Like the sudden secrecy around the mail, how she'd grab it before anyone else, eyes darting. Like the strange calls they'd take in whispers behind closed doors. It didn't take long before I understood something more was coming. Not just emotional distance, a removal, a plan. I found the senior living brochure in the trash bin beside the garage. Its corner had been torn, but the words were clear. Affordable independent living for seniors. Underlined, with a phone number circled in ink. They hadn't even tried to hide it. Maybe they thought I was too old to snoop. Or maybe they just didn't care anymore if I knew. Either way, it told me what I needed to know. They wanted me gone. And this time, it wouldn't be passive. It would be arranged, sanitized, justified, maybe even presented like a kindness. We just want you to have your own space. We think you'll be more comfortable with people your age. But the truth would bleed through. They wanted their life back, the one they never acknowledged I had paid for. I sat on the garage step that night, the metal cold beneath me, and watched the stars in silence. I thought about my husband, about the home we once dreamed of, about the legacy we thought we were leaving behind. I imagined him sitting beside me, holding my hand the way he used to when neither of us had the words for what we felt. I wished he could see this. I wished he couldn't. Somewhere between those thoughts, a question formed, one I had never dared to ask before. What if I left? Not for them. For me. What if I stopped waiting for someone to rescue me from the garage and simply walked out of it? Not with anger, but with clarity. I didn't know yet what that would look like, but I knew something had cracked open inside me that night. Not a wound, a door. And this time, I would be the one to walk through it. It started with a drawer, a shallow, dented metal drawer attached to a forgotten filing cabinet wedged behind an old air compressor in the far corner of the garage. It had been there since I moved in, probably since they moved in, and I had paid it no attention. But that morning, after finding the second senior living brochure carelessly folded beneath a stack of expired coupons on the kitchen counter, I felt something in my chest clench tight and cold, and I turned toward that drawer like it had called my name. It groaned when I opened it, reluctant after years of being ignored, but it gave way eventually. Inside were the things I had almost forgotten I kept: bank documents, insurance copies, power of attorney papers, savings bonds, old house deeds. My name was still on everything, and I mean everything: the car, the house, even the utilities. I had been the one who refinanced when they were drowning in debt 6 years ago. I had signed as guarantor when their credit score disqualified them. My husband had warned me to take our names off eventually, to transition everything to them once they were stable. But I never did. I suppose I held on because it made me feel needed, relevant, safe. And now, standing in a drafty garage holding the yellowed envelope of legal documents, I realized how much power I had forgotten I possessed. My hands trembled as I flipped through each one, not from weakness, but from the rush of something I hadn't felt in years. Control. Ownership. Proof. I wasn't just a guest in this house. I was the foundation. The invisible scaffolding holding it all together. They had locked me in a box built on my own name, and in doing so, they had forgotten that I held the key. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel helpless. I felt dangerous. Not in a loud way, not with fists or threats or drama, but in the way a storm gathers quietly over a still ocean. I sat down on the cot with the envelope in my lap and made a mental checklist. What accounts were still open? What payments still ran through me? Where did the ownership papers reside? Every question had an answer, and every answer led me one step closer to a truth they had never bothered to consider. You cannot exile someone who still owns the land. That night, I waited until they were asleep, their laughter replaced by the dull hum of the dishwasher and the occasional creak of wooden beams shifting in the night. I crept upstairs for the first time in weeks, the stairs groaning beneath my cautious feet. I moved like a thief, even though nothing in that house was truly theirs. In the office, the one I had once used for quilting, I opened the filing cabinet they thought I had forgotten. Inside was the updated deed. My husband's handwriting was still scribbled across one corner from a note he left me the year we refinanced. Don't forget, you're still on everything. Love you. I almost cried. Almost. But I didn't. I was past tears now. Past mourning. I was strategizing. I took pictures of every document. I uploaded them to an old cloud account they didn't know I had. I logged into the joint utility accounts and printed out payment histories, all still under my name. Even the Wi-Fi they used to stream the shows that muffled my loneliness each night. Mine. And then I did something I hadn't done in years. I went into the safe in the master bedroom closet. The code hadn't changed. Birth dates were too easy to remember. Inside were the original loan papers, emergency cash, and the will. My husband's will. I had forgotten we kept a copy at home. I unfolded the pages with slow fingers, scanning through each section until I found it. The clause we had added quietly, one summer after the cancer diagnosis, when we sat in the backyard drinking lemonade and talking about everything we hoped wouldn't happen. It was short, just a line, but it was there. Should the surviving spouse require residence and care, the house shall remain in her legal control, and any dependent adult children shall not impede her access or safety therein. My husband had known. He had seen something I hadn't, or maybe just feared something I couldn't admit. Either way, that sentence was enough. Enough to hold them accountable. Enough to take back the narrative. I placed the papers back, closed the safe, and descended the stairs like a soldier retreating into the shadows after retrieving war plans. Back in the garage, I sat with the envelope in my lap until the sun began to rise, soft golden light spilling through the dusty window, turning the shadows into something gentle. I wasn't ready yet. Not quite. I needed more time, more certainty. But now I had something I hadn't felt since before my husband died. I had leverage, and with leverage comes the slow rebirth of dignity. The next day, I smiled when my daughter-in-law told me they'd be going away for the weekend and asked if I could keep an eye on the place, as if I were the help, as if this weren't my name stamped into every corner of every room. I nodded, said I'd be happy to, and I meant it. Because while they were gone, I planned to visit an attorney, quietly, calmly, with no fireworks or screaming matches, just paperwork, just facts, just the truth, served legally, sealed in an envelope, and delivered not out of revenge, but out of restoration. I wasn't going to ask them to love me. I wasn't even going to ask them to apologize, but I was going to ask them to leave. I waited until their car pulled out of the driveway, wheels crunching over gravel, the muffled sound of pop music fading as they turned the corner and disappeared down the road. I didn't wave goodbye. I simply closed the garage door, locked it from the inside, and changed into my best sweater, the one I had worn to church the Easter after my youngest grandchild was born. It still smelled faintly of lavender and memory. I brushed my hair, the same way I used to when I had somewhere to be, somewhere to feel seen. Then I grabbed the envelope of documents, tucked it carefully into my bag, and stepped out into the morning sun with a posture they hadn't seen in years. My spine straightened, my shoulders pulled back. There was no bitterness in my step, only purpose. The bus stop was 3 blocks away, and I walked each one like I was reclaiming it. I didn't call ahead to the law office. I just showed up, sat in the waiting room with the quiet dignity of someone who has nothing left to lose but everything to protect. When they asked if I had an appointment, I said no, but I had proof. And when the receptionist looked down and saw the name of the firm embossed on the old estate envelope I was clutching, she stood up straighter. "One moment, ma'am," she said. And within minutes, I was ushered into a quiet, wood-paneled room where the air smelled of trust and ink. The attorney was younger than I expected, polite but guarded, the way professionals get when they're not sure what kind of story they're about to hear. I didn't waste time. I laid out the documents, every last one, and explained, without tears or theatrics, exactly what had happened. Not just the garage, not just the disrespect, but the pattern, the erasure. The dismissal of someone who had legally and emotionally built the roof over their heads. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look away. He just listened, nodding slowly, marking a few notes with a pen that clicked only once. When I finished, he folded his hands and said, with quiet certainty, "You still have legal control. If you want them out, we can begin the process." I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. I simply nodded and said, "Begin." We filed the notice that day, quietly, properly. The law was slow, but it was certain. Everything was still in my name. They hadn't bothered to transfer it after the refinancing, and in the eyes of the county, I was still the primary homeowner. My name sat atop the property deed like a banner they never looked up to read. The eviction notice wouldn't come immediately. There were procedures, notifications, waiting periods, but that didn't bother me. I wasn't after speed. I was after certainty. And now I had it. I left the law office with a folder of next steps, legal language folded neatly like revenge pressed between linen sheets, and walked home without rush. The sun felt warmer, the air softer. Even the garage, when I opened its crooked door and stepped back inside, felt less like a prison and more like a war room. I was done waiting for their kindness. I was building a future without it. That evening, I sat quietly as the clock ticked past midnight, the silence above me proving they were still gone. I began sorting through more files, making lists of what I owned, what I needed, and what I would change. I pulled out old receipts, old bank records, account passwords, phone numbers of people I hadn't called in years. I wasn't just preparing to remove them, I was preparing to live again, fully, independently, and without apology. And as I worked, I felt something unfamiliar rise in my chest. Not joy, not quite, but a stillness. A kind of peace that comes when you've stopped begging for scraps and started cooking your own meal. The next morning, they returned. My son knocked on the garage door like it was a formality. "We're back," he said, voice cheerful, casual, like nothing had happened, like I hadn't been surviving in a concrete box while they sipped cocktails by the ocean. I opened the door. I looked at him, really looked. And for the first time, I didn't see my little boy. I saw a man who had chosen comfort over character, convenience over care. I nodded, said nothing, and returned to my chair. He didn't notice the manila folder on the cot. He didn't ask about my plans. He never did. That week, I watched them with new eyes. Every time she laughed at the kitchen island, I saw the woman who would be receiving a legal envelope soon. Every time he scrolled his phone while I cleaned the floor, I remembered the documents that bore my name and not his. Every act of dismissal became evidence. Every word unspoken became fuel. They had no idea, and I preferred it that way. I didn't need confrontation. I didn't want apologies. I only wanted the keys returned, the space cleared, and the house silent again. Not with grief, but with peace. I began cleaning more methodically, packing up old photos, organizing my things, not in a frantic rush, but with the calm certainty of someone who knows what's coming. The eviction notice would be drafted and delivered within the month, and when it arrived, it wouldn't be screamed. It would be stamped, official, irrevocable, just like the way they had treated me. No drama, just dismissal. The poetic symmetry of it made me sleep better at night. I was no longer waiting for justice. I was becoming it. The days between filing and delivery were the longest, but they were also the most liberating. I moved through the house like a quiet witness to my own restoration, touching surfaces I once scrubbed, walking halls I once tiptoed through, now with the confidence of someone who remembers what she built. I didn't announce anything. I didn't say a word about lawyers or deeds or what was coming. I just watched, and waiting became my weapon. My son began to notice something different. He'd glance at me longer than usual, as if trying to remember what I used to look like before I faded into the walls. Once, I caught him staring as I washed a single teacup at the sink, my movements slow, almost meditative. "You okay, Ma?" he asked, not because he cared, not really, but because he sensed the shift, like animals sense the weather turning. I turned, met his eyes, and simply said, "Never better." That was all. And that was enough to unsettle him. I could feel it in the way he stood silently a moment too long, like he expected me to elaborate, to beg, to explain myself. But I had no more explanations left to give. That was the beginning of the subtle unraveling. My daughter-in-law became more curt, less careful. She asked why I was folding my clothes so neatly. "You going somewhere?" she joked, eyes sharp with suspicion. I shrugged. "Just organizing," I said, smiling as I folded the last of my sweaters into a clean box and taped the lid. It wasn't a lie. I was organizing, just not for the reasons she hoped. The kids stopped entering the garage altogether. Even the youngest, who used to sneak in for snacks or stories, no longer wandered to my door. I wondered if they had been told not to. Or worse, if they simply stopped wanting to. The house felt tenser now, like the walls had been told a secret and couldn't wait to whisper it to everyone else. Meals grew quieter, doors closed faster. They watched me now, not out of love, but with unease, like I was a puzzle they couldn't solve. And I let them wonder. I kept cleaning, kept smiling, kept arranging little pieces of my life into neat, labeled boxes. But under the surface, I was counting days. 17, 16, 15, the countdown to clarity. Then came the day they crossed a line they didn't even know existed. I had stepped out for a walk, something I rarely did, and returned earlier than expected. As I opened the front door, I heard them in the living room, not whispering this time, but laughing, joking, and then I heard it. "What if she dies in there?" my daughter-in-law said, mid-laugh. "I mean, seriously, the smell alone?" My son didn't respond. Or maybe he did, but the roar in my ears drowned out whatever words followed. I stood frozen in the hallway, hand still on the doorknob, a single shopping bag in the other. Something inside me went cold. Not the kind of cold that comes from grief or even betrayal, but the kind that comes from clarity, a final, irreversible knowing. They weren't just trying to forget me. They were mocking me, preparing for my absence, laughing at the possibility of my death as if I were already rotting wood in the foundation. That moment, more than any other, solidified what was to come. I placed the bag on the kitchen counter and walked silently back to the garage, where I sat with the folder and reread the draft of the notice. The lawyer had sent it for my review. Official, firm, perfect. All it needed was my signature. I signed it that night, slowly, carefully. The pen didn't tremble. My hand didn't hesitate. It was the most deliberate movement I'd made in years. The finality of it was soothing, like placing the last piece in a puzzle I had been trying to solve since the day I was told the garage was mine. And now it was almost time to return the favor. But I still said nothing. The days that followed were a study in silence. I observed every detail of their lives, the grocery lists, the missed payments, the tension between them when they thought I wasn't listening. They were struggling, financially and otherwise, but they were too proud to admit it. I knew the house was their anchor, their last claim to security. And yet they treated the anchor like dead weight. Like me. The irony was poetic. I had given them shelter, food, babysitting, inheritance, and they had returned it all with silence and dust. I watched the children play in the backyard, oblivious to the storm gathering. I watched my son pour coffee into the mug I gave him on his college graduation day, the one that said, Mom's favorite. He never noticed that it was chipped now, just like everything else. The notice would arrive within the week. They didn't know. But I did. And I began to prepare for the fallout. I had already contacted a locksmith. I had already arranged for utilities to be transferred. I had already spoken to a contractor about repurposing the garage into a reading room. My reading room. Every step I took was legal, quiet, precise, because I didn't want to burn the house down. I just wanted to take it back, not to hold over them, not to punish them, but to remind myself, and maybe the world, that I was not disposable. I was not furniture. I was not a guest in a home I paid for. And when that envelope finally hit the welcome mat, when they tore it open with trembling hands and wide eyes, they would finally understand that the garage wasn't a sentence. It was a setup, and the woman they tried to store away in it was about to walk them to the door. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, a manila envelope stamped with formal lettering and sealed with quiet finality. I knew the delivery time. The attorney had called the night before to confirm. 10:15 a.m. And right on schedule, I heard the knock on the front door echo through the house, 3 polite raps followed by footsteps retreating down the porch. I didn't move. I didn't need to. I already knew what it said. I heard my daughter-in-law answer the door, the creak of hinges opening into a silence she hadn't earned. I imagined the frown forming between her brows, the way her manicured nails would dig into the envelope seal, and the silence that would follow once her eyes met the words. And then, as if scripted by the universe itself, I heard it. Her voice sharp, shrill, slicing through the air like broken glass. "What is this?" she shouted. Footsteps. Fast. Heavy. The sound of the envelope slapping against the kitchen counter. Is this a joke? Then silence again. Not because there was nothing to say, but because they were reading it now. Together. Line by line. Word by word. The legal language clear, cold, and irreversible. I sat on the cot with my hands folded in my lap, still as a statue, waiting. I didn't have to wait long. My son came to the garage door. He didn't knock. He just opened it, too fast, too loud, like he was trying to control a fire already out of hand. "Ma," he said, holding the paper like it was poison. "What is this?" His face was pale, not angry, just shaken, like a man who'd finally realized the bridge he burned was the only one left. I looked at him calmly, my voice steady. "It's an eviction notice," I said. "You have 30 days to vacate." He blinked. Once, twice. "You're evicting us?" His voice cracked at the end, disbelief curdling into something almost childlike. "After everything we've done for you?" That sentence, "after everything we've done for you," almost made me laugh. But I didn't. I stayed silent, letting the weight of that hypocrisy sit in the air like a rotten perfume. "You've lived in my house," I said quietly. "I paid for it. I kept it in my name. I paid the bills. I raised your children. I supported you through every crisis. And when your father died, you put me in the garage like clutter you didn't want to throw away but couldn't stand to look at." His eyes welled up, but I had no sympathy left to offer. "You didn't speak up," he said, softer now. "You never said anything. How were we supposed to know you felt—" "You knew," I cut in. "You always knew. You just didn't care." The silence that followed was thicker than grief. It was truth, finally spoken aloud, echoing off the concrete walls of a garage they had hoped would break me. "She's crying," he said after a pause, like that fact was supposed to change something. "Good," I said. "Maybe now she'll feel something. Anything." He stood there for another long second, and I saw him, not as the boy I raised, but as the man who made choices. Choices to ignore me, to minimize me, to let someone else decide that my place was next to a lawnmower and a stack of old paint cans. "You have 30 days, I repeated, standing now, facing him fully. "There will be no yelling, no fights, no tears that weren't already shed." His lip trembled, just slightly. "Where are we supposed to go?" he asked. And for the first time, I saw the fear behind the arrogance, the panic beneath the entitlement. "That's not my problem anymore," I said. "You made me invisible. You made me unnecessary. You can live without me, remember?" He turned without another word, shutting the door so quietly behind him it barely clicked. I sat back down, shaking, not with rage, but with the release of years I had held inside like breath. Upstairs I heard movement, raised voices, doors opening and closing. I heard my daughter-in-law sobbing, not from remorse, but from fear. Fear of losing comfort, of losing status, of losing the house that was never hers to begin with. I heard them argue about money, about where to go, about how it had come to this. And I said nothing. I sat in that garage, the same one where I was once discarded, and I smiled. Not out of spite, but out of survival. I had spent too long trying to make myself small so they could feel big. I had shrunk myself to fit into the spaces they were willing to give me. But no more. The next few days were quiet, tense. They tiptoed around me, uncertain now, no longer bold in their dismissal. She tried to make small talk. I answered with politeness, not warmth. He offered to bring me coffee. I declined. The children avoided me. I didn't chase them. They would learn one day what had happened here, and perhaps they'd understand who I really was. When the formal papers arrived, hand-delivered by a process server, no one spoke to me for the rest of the day. And I didn't mind. I cleaned the garage that afternoon, not out of habit, but out of preparation. It wouldn't be my room much longer. Soon, it would be what I chose it to be. A sewing studio, a reading room, a place filled not with pain, but with peace. I had imagined this moment 100 times. I thought I would feel triumphant, but what I felt was something quieter. Freedom. I didn't want them to suffer. I wanted them to leave. I didn't need revenge. I needed space. And now, I had earned it. They didn't leave with drama. No screaming, no confrontation, no dramatic apologies thrown at my feet. They simply began to pack, slowly at first, like they didn't believe it would really happen. Like the letter had been a bad dream they were waiting to wake up from. But the days passed, and I didn't rescind it. I didn't speak unless necessary. I made no threats. I simply existed, quietly, in the same house they had once treated like a kingdom built without me. The tension grew heavy, not with conflict, but with the weight of their own choices. My daughter-in-law stopped looking me in the eye. My son became visibly thinner, his stress etched across his jawline, his shoulders slumped like a man shrinking beneath the truth. The children, young enough not to understand legal consequences but old enough to feel change in the air, stopped asking questions. Their toys were boxed. Their laughter went silent. The house became a stage after the curtain falls. Props half-moved, actors disoriented. The script abruptly ended. I watched them wrap dishes I once purchased with the same hands that used to stir soup for them when they were sick. I watched them tape shut boxes filled with bed sheets I had sewn, books I had read to their children, photos they had taken in front of walls I had painted. I didn't interfere. I didn't help. Not out of cruelty, but out of finality. This was no longer my responsibility. They had pushed me out of their circle long ago. I was simply returning the gesture with paperwork. On the 12th day of the 30 they were given, a moving truck arrived. Not a large one. Not enough for a lifetime of memories. Just enough for what they could carry now that the foundation beneath them was gone. I watched from the garage window as strangers lifted couches and lamps and toys into the truck bed. My son directed them, his voice low, his words clipped. She stood on the lawn holding a clipboard, dressed like someone who hadn't quite accepted how much they'd lost. At one point, she walked past the garage and looked inside. Our eyes met for less than a second. Her gaze dropped first. She kept walking. I don't know what she felt. I don't need to know. That evening, the house grew still. They had taken nearly everything that wasn't bolted down, but the house somehow felt fuller than it had in years. Not cluttered, just open, breathing, real. My son approached me once, just before they pulled out of the driveway for the last time. He stood at the threshold of the garage, hands in his pockets, looking older than he ever had. "We'll figure things out," he said. Not quite a plea, not quite a goodbye. Just a sentence tossed into the space between us, as though hoping it might land somewhere soft. I didn't answer. I simply nodded. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been carved into the silence of those past months. He lingered a moment longer, then turned, walked to the car, and drove away. No hugs, no tears, just distance. After the taillights vanished around the bend, I stood in the driveway for the first time in months. The night air was crisp, the wind brushing gently against my sweater, and I felt light. Not happy, not sad, just weightless, as if I had been carrying a soaked blanket for years, and someone had finally wrung it dry. The garage no longer felt like exile. It felt like the origin of something new. I unlocked the side door and walked into the house, not tiptoeing, not apologizing, just walking. Room by room, I turned on the lights. Kitchen, living room, my old sewing nook. Each switch clicked like a heartbeat. I stood in the center of the living room and breathed deeply. It smelled of lemon polish and vacancy. I opened the windows, let the stale air out. A hawk called from somewhere beyond the trees, and the dusk spilled golden across the tile floor like paint. This house had stories in its walls, some painful, some beautiful. All mine. Over the next few days, I took my time putting it back together. I donated half of what they left behind. Their clutter, their reminders, their careless fingerprints, gone. I painted the guest room a soft, hopeful green. I turned the master bedroom into my own, finally, completely, and filled it with fresh linens, new curtains, and sunlight. The garage? I kept it. Not as a memory, but as a lesson. I converted it slowly into a reading room. Bookshelves where the cot used to be. A soft blue chair under the window. A framed photograph of me and my husband near the door, his arm around my shoulder, his eyes full of the love that started all this. That picture reminded me of who I was before silence made me small. I didn't reach out to them. I didn't chase them down. I gave them what they gave me. Absence. But not out of hate. Out of peace. There's a difference. Hate is noisy, restless. It takes energy to maintain. Peace is silent and still and solid. And for the first time in years, I had peace. No one interrupted my meals. No one mocked my presence. No one treated my grief like an inconvenience. I found myself laughing again. Small, surprised bursts when I spilled flour on the counter or watched squirrels argue outside the window. I played music. I danced while making tea. I watered the garden. And when I sat down at night, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of lavender and belonging, I realized that loneliness and solitude were not the same. One is forced, the other is chosen, and I had finally chosen mine. Some mornings, I still wake before the sun rises, the way I used to when the babies needed feeding, or when my husband left early for work. Old habits don't die, they echo. Soft reminders of the lives we once carried on our backs without question. I sit by the window with my tea, wrapped in a hand-knit shawl, And I look out at the quiet lawn now trimmed and calm, the birds fluttering across the hedges, and I realize how far I've come from the version of myself that first walked into that garage. I no longer measure my worth in chores completed or favors granted. I no longer mistake endurance for love. That woman, the one who accepted crumbs while offering banquets, she still lives inside me, but now she shares space with someone wiser, stronger, someone who no longer asks for permission to exist. The eviction didn't just remove them from my home, it removed the weight of their approval from my shoulders. I used to wonder if I was cruel for doing it, if sending them away meant I had failed as a mother, but now I know. Failing would have been staying silent. Failing would have been continuing to sleep beside paint cans while pretending that love could still grow in cold, dark corners. I was not cruel. I was clear. And clarity, I've learned, is often mistaken for cruelty by those who benefit from your confusion. They haven't contacted me since they left. No calls, no letters, not even on my birthday. And while a part of me still aches for the sound of my grandchildren's voices, I've come to understand that their silence is not my punishment. It is my protection. I don't know what they tell people when asked why they moved out. Maybe they say I lost my mind. Maybe they paint me as a bitter old woman who snapped after losing her husband. People always prefer simple stories. But I don't owe anyone the truth except myself. And my truth is this. I was placed in the garage 2 days after burying the man I loved for 42 years. I was dismissed by the very people I sacrificed everything for. I was turned into an afterthought in a home I paid for. And when I could have broken, I rebuilt. Quietly, legally, gracefully, I rebuilt. Some nights I still set an extra plate on the table by accident. I still find myself reaching for toys in the grocery aisle, forgetting I no longer buy them for sticky little hands that used to call me grandma. But I've stopped mourning what I lost and started honoring what I reclaimed. I host a book club now, just 3 women, all widows, all mothers, all with stories too heavy for small talk. We drink tea, laugh louder than we're supposed to, and we don't apologize for taking up space. I tell them about my reading room. They call it the Liberation Garage. We joke, but we know what it means. We know what it's like to be erased by the very people who once clung to our legs in fear. We know what it costs to choose ourselves after a lifetime of being chosen last. I've learned to garden again. Not for them. For me. I plant lavender and rosemary and let the scents drift through the open kitchen windows. I've replaced the photos on the hallway wall, not out of spite, but out of healing. My wedding picture still hangs there, but now it's joined by a framed note my husband once scribbled on a grocery list. Don't forget, you're the backbone of this family. That's all I needed to remember. I was not meant to be forgotten. I was not meant to be boxed away when I stopped giving. I was meant to live, to bloom, to continue. Even after grief, even after betrayal, even after silence. And now I do. Not loudly, not with vengeance, but with peace. There's a softness to my days now, a steadiness that no one can take from me. I cook what I want, when I want. I sleep with the windows open. I read until my eyes close. I laugh when the kettle whistles, and sometimes I cry when the sun hits the couch just right, because I remember what it was like to feel invisible, and now I feel seen, even if only by myself. And that, I've learned, is enough. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe one day they'll call. Maybe one day the children will knock on my door, older, curious, with questions in their eyes. If they do, I'll open it. Not with resentment, not with regret, but with truth. I'll tell them who I was, what I endured, what I became. I'll show them the room where I once slept beside paint cans and dreams deferred. And I'll show them the room I built afterward, full of books, full of light, full of dignity. Not because I want them to feel guilty, but because I want them to understand that survival isn't the same as living. And I want them to know I finally chose to live. I was put in the garage, but I gave the eviction notice. And in doing so, I finally stepped out of that cold, forgotten space and into the warmth of my own story. Written not by the ones who left, but by the woman who stayed.